Tread carefully with allegories. Mess with allegories at your peril, and make sure that if you're doing it, you really understand what you're doing and the consequences involved. In this special little quick episode of the Author Culture Podcast, I'm going to talk about a couple of recent choices. So yes, this is a little more of a current events episode, and how they messed with allegories and the consequences that could happen from that. And especially because one of these items is in fact more recent and may not end up being something that bites the allegory changers on the rear, but it could very well be that way. And if you're thinking about the Narnia situation, yes, I am thinking about that situation as well and what Netflix is going to do with that. So in this episode, we're going to talk about what it is to work with an allegory, the difference between an allegory and just doing a general message, because you know me, I believe that all stories have messages because all stories have messages. And then we are also going to talk about a couple of recent examples with the new live action Snow White, which at the time of this recording just came out about a month ago in March 2025. And the news in the last week that Aslan the lion in the Netflix adaptation may in fact be voiced by a woman. Both of these things involve tweaking allegories, and they both, well, in the case of Snow White, had consequences, and in the case of the Narnia situation, could have consequences as well. And hopefully this also gives you some insight into the power of allegories and also the pitfalls of using allegories in your own science fiction and fantasy writing. Super excited to dive in. So this is Janeen Ippolito. Let's talk. And welcome to the Author Culture Podcast, where we are all about helping science fiction and fantasy authors achieve sustainable success in a chaotic publishing world. And if you haven't already, do make sure that you have hit that subscribe button on YouTube, that you subscribe to this podcast on Substack. And also, this episode is actually a small snippet of a larger episode that I just dropped exclusively for my paid subscribers on Substack. It was one of my bi-weekly current events roundups that they get every 2 weeks. So this is just going to be a quick little snippet of that much longer conversation. And so if you are all about getting publishing hot takes and news, and you don't want to go trawling around Google, and you want that information from someone who is going to approach things from a place of objectivity as much as I can, and will tell you when I have biases, and can just wrap all that up for you so that you don't really have to go onto social media or all those places where outrage is king, please do sign up for my Substack and become a paid subscriber. So $5 a month or $50 a year, and you get that. You get access to my exclusive subscriber chat, and you also get my undying gratitude for helping keep this podcast going so that I can continue helping authors just like you find clarity, confidence, and the ability to figure out the best choices for your unique goals, not someone else's. Alrighty, now we're going to talk just a little bit about this whole situation with allegories. So of course, you know me, I love to define the terms. And in this case, we're actually going to define the terms here using the Cambridge dictionary. Usually I just go to the Merriam-Webster, but we're actually going to use this dictionary from Cambridge because, after all, we're talking about Narnia for one of these examples. So every book, every story has a message. It has that core thing that you are trying to communicate. This is not controversial. This is not saying that every book has some super heavy agenda to it, but books are words. Words are communication. Communication says something, which means that your book and your story that you're writing, as well as every book and story that you take in, whether in written form or whether it's an adaptation into a TV series or a movie, or etc., all of that has a message. Trust me. It also is a core thing that shows up in your marketing, which is why I'm really big on authors knowing and owning their messages, because it will help with your marketing. An allegory is it goes a bit deeper than a message. And so according to this dictionary, Cambridge.org, Cambridge, one of those two, an allegory is a story, play, poem, picture, or other work in which the characters and events represent particular qualities that relate to morals, religion, or politics. So their example sentences include, the play can be read as an allegory, or Augustine's City of God is an allegory of the triumph of good over evil. So whereas a message can be more or less didactic, it can be more or less intended to teach, sometimes it might just be something to make you chill out, like, yay, true love is great, let's enjoy a rom-com, etc. When we're talking about allegories, these things are more intentional, and especially if the author is intentionally creating an allegory, they are being very, very careful and specific about how things are being portrayed. They want you to learn something. They want it to reflect something very, very specifically. So, in terms of that, when we're talking about science fiction and fantasy, these two massive genres with all of their subgenres and mini-genres and mashup genres, these things are ripe for allegorical storytelling because you're talking about events that often happen in secondary world, alternate history, alternate present world, sometime in the future. The settings are often different in some way. And so the idea of representational work, the idea of using this dragon or using this spaceship or using this planet or using this magical forest or something to represent something else, that happens all the time in science fiction and fantasy. And it actually makes it very easy to get allegories and messages and agendas into science fiction and fantasy because you can so easily represent it in different ways. It's just right there for the taking. And if you do your job and make it really entertaining, people will just go along with it until they eventually go, I don't know if I agree with this. So allegories and science fiction and fantasy go together very, very naturally. And we're talking about these two examples I have here. One of them is Snow White. And Snow White is a folktale found by the Brothers Grimm doing their research way back hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And so they're doing all this research and collecting all of this different folklore. And so Snow White, no doubt, was an allegory for quite a few different things. Because at that time, these are just things you would teach people or tell people to, give them messages, to convey deeper truths, etc. We're talking about a culture that doesn't have the widespread literacy that we have today. So this is the way they're going to communicate these bigger truths, things related to morals, religion, or politics. And so Snow White already has that wrapped up in it. And then when the Snow White adaptation in 1937 happened, so that was an adaptation of the folktale. That was something that Disney chose as their first full-length animated feature to adapt, was not the original. Then that came with its own level of allegory, and there was this one post on social media that was talking about how the movie interpretation, the 1937 movie interpretation, was in fact an allegory of World War II. You're welcome to track that down and find that. Just type in Snow White allegory of World War II, etc., and check that out. So now we have extra layers of allegories here. We have the original interpretations that the people at the time who created this folktale of Snow White, the things they would have used it for, the representations they would have seen it, and then we also have the movie, the 1937 movie adaptation by Disney, and what people would think that meant. And then Disney goes to do a live action adaptation of that. And that's where things get extra interesting because Disney says, okay, we don't want to go with either of those adaptations. And I will actually add something here. Disney did do a different adaptation of this that was live action in their TV show Once Upon a Time. And in that one, they definitely took a lot of creative liberties with it because that was a serialized television show, and it was in part based on there were some different influences in it as well. But I did have to mention that real quick. That was definitely another live action adaptation of it that had some different choices made. But for this one, Disney, the 2025 version, Disney wanted to do an adaptation specifically of the 1937 movie. So doing a live action of their own intellectual property. And when they did that, they said, you know what, we're going to take this allegory in a different direction. You know how I mentioned allegories or morals, religions, and politics? They decided we're going to take it in the direction of politics and some with morals. Now, when you are doing that, when you're deciding to take this movie and do a different version of it, that's going to be sticky. And they had to know it was going to be sticky because this is a story that doesn't just have all the allegorical interpretations of the core story, but it also has the interpretations people have made of the original Disney adaptation, the adaptation that was purely animated. And so they decided to go for it anyway. There was back and forth and controversy over which actress said what and et cetera. I'm not really going to go into that. But they made so many changes to it and they did so many tweaks to it that the thing is, it really upset people who are really attached to those allegories. And that's why I'm saying you need to adapt and change allegories, especially in this case, allegories attached to your own intellectual property that you already made. You need to do that at your own peril and do it very carefully and with sensitivity to people who liked the original material. And maybe if you're thinking about this in terms of books, maybe you're rewriting a book. And maybe the original book, didn't have too many fans who talk to them and they're doing okay with it. So you're going to rework it. That's fine. I'm in that place with one of my books where I'm totally rewriting it. And I made it very clear, the handful of people who really enjoyed the original, I'm not dissing them. I just needed to go in a different direction. Disney didn't do that. Disney decided, we're just going to do this whole new angle for it. And we're going to insert these different political views that ironically don't work within the context of the story. It's really interesting how people want to take something that's very a classical kind of kingdom, fairy tale kingdom, benevolent monarchy thing. And they want to say, but actually it has this completely different governmental style that's very similar to socialism. And you're like, well, how do you have a socialist kingdom? I guess in the Disney world, you do that. Again, speaking purely in terms of the world building here, that's very challenging, but they're going to go for that. And so I think they realized at a certain point, they had a little bit of a hot mess on their hands with this. And then just like, we're going to just go out for it anyway, and we're going to see what happens. Although they did also restrict some of the promotions towards the end. So I think they kind of knew they had stirred the pot too much here and it wasn't going to go well for them. And it didn't, and the movie hasn't made the scads and scads of money they were hoping it was going to make. And people who had these very different attachments to the Disney version and the fairy tale, the folktale version, both really, really got annoyed by this whole situation. Now, I'm sure those of you who are out there who are like, oh, whatever, I enjoyed it for what it was, and et cetera, that's fine. But there are plenty of people who were not. And I think it just really shows that you have to be careful when you're adapting allegories. When people have this one set view of things, and the more popular that set view is, the more that you just have to tread carefully. And I'm not sure if this just fell through the cracks. I'm not here to impute positive or negative things to Disney's motivations or intentions behind this. Plenty of other people can make that kind of commentary, but in terms of just talking about the fiscal sense of doing this kind of adaptation, they weren't thinking clearly in terms of that. And there were consequences for that. And how that connects with this next bit of news is, of course, as of the time of recording this, which is April 8th, 2025, news just dropped a bit ago about Netflix saying that they might be considering Meryl Streep's voice for the computer animated character of Aslan. Now, Aslan is a Christ figure. We know this because C.S. Lewis, the author, was an open and vocal Christian, an apologist. He wrote an allegory. He did this very intentionally. He wanted this to be super, super clear. And so when you're talking about that, there's not really any gray area here in terms of changing things because he wrote it to be a certain way. So making the choice of taking Aslan, who is a representation of Christ, he's a Christ figure, he's a Christ symbol in the story, and having him voiced by Meryl Streep, what are we thinking about here? Like, what is their intention behind this? And again, no shade on Meryl Streep. She's an incredibly gifted actress. She has won many awards. She has been nominated for more awards. She's had some fantastic portrayals that I've loved. And she's very gifted vocally, and she's very good at accents. But Aslan is a male lion. And even if you're thinking about the story itself, just the story, not in terms of the change and what it says about respect for C.S. Lewis's religious beliefs, even the story itself talks about him having a mane, and he shakes his mane, and at some point his mane gets cut off, and that indicates he is a male lion. It's just right there. So having it voiced by Meryl Streep, unless they're trying to do something where she's trying to make her voice sound masculine, it's a very strange, and I would say disrespectful choice to the source material, and I would also say potentially very economically foolish for Netflix. So being open and clear about this, I am a Christian. I love the Chronicles of Narnia books. I love C.S. Lewis's apologetics. And so in that respect, I'm not cool with Aslan being voiced by a female. It doesn't make any sense for the storyline. It doesn't respect his intentional allegory in this entire book. And yeah, I am not cool with that. And also, as someone who really believes in authorial intent, this is also a lack of respect for authorial intent. And it very much is leaned into this kind of expressivist, I just want what I want, and I just want to juice it up for a new era and everything. And I just feel it means this. And I'm also not a fan of that in general, in any way, shape, or form. I am very much, what did the author mean by this? Not, I'm just going to interpret it whatever I feel by it, and whatever I think about it, that kind of rules my perceptions. So those are two areas where I am not cool with this. And then also fiscally, I mean, who do they think is going to be viewing this? A lot of people were a little bit concerned that it was, Netflix adapting it. And so it's not going to be great. And then there are people who didn't even love the other movie adaptations that happened in the early 2000s, people who didn't like the adaptations that happened earlier than that. So there are people who just kind of wrote off any adaptations, they're not going to capture this anyway. And that's fair. You can choose to like or dislike any of the movie adaptations. It's not required that you enjoy them to be a C.S. Lewis fan. But in this respect, it just really doesn't make sense fiscally for them to do this and potentially alienate so many people who would be interested in this story otherwise. It feels like they're just making that mistake that they made with Snow White all over again, where they're like, hey, let's just alienate people who really otherwise might be interested in at least watching this and commenting on it. Now, that being said, I have a slight suspicion here in terms of marketing that maybe all of this is just a way to get more negative publicity for the movie and get people to talk about it. I don't know if that's true. That was something when I was talking with my husband about this. He's like, are they just doing this just to get people riled up and see if there's pushback? And by the way, there will be pushback. So they did poke the bear there. But is this some kind of just marketing ploy, like negative marketing, negative publicity, any talk is good talk kind of thing? I'm not sure. It's still new. But I did want to bring that up because, again, this is just like a perfect storm where this one allegorical adaptation that drastically went off from anything previously and also made some different changes that didn't really make sense with any of the source material. We just experienced that, and now we're trying this with a female voice of Aslan. I don't really know where they're going with this. There's a couple of angles for this, and we will see what happens. Of course, it is a free country, and they did manage to get some kind of rights to this, so they can do this. I don't know where the Lewis estate is going with that, where they're like, oh yeah, we're just going to sign off on all of this, but that's where they are. So we will see where this goes. If nothing else, we have some other movie adaptations that were done more or less well. I'm sure that there were plenty of debates and thoughts about the fidelity of those adaptations versus not. We have the books. Lewis wrote a lot of things. There's lots to enjoy. So we'll just have to see where that plays out in terms of the situation with the voice of Aslan. But in the larger scope of things, both of these situations really show that when you are dealing with allegories, you are dealing with really potent storytelling and narrative structures and frameworks. And so when you're using them in your books, especially science fiction and fantasy, use them carefully, use them well, and understand that they can be polarizing and people will take very different interpretations of them. And as much as I go on about authorial intent, people are going to interpret your intent in different ways. There's not a whole lot you can do about that in the end. You can't literally change people's minds or thoughts, nor would we want that power, because that would be creepy and that would be dystopian, which I am halfway through the new Hunger Games book, and I might just be talking about that in a future episode, so make sure you keep tuning in to the Author Culture podcast. But dystopian situations with thought control aside, it's a challenge to do an allegory, and I think especially if you're an author who has very strong values, and I know many of you in my audience here are Christians, it can be really tempting to want to create something allegorical. And then that can be challenging because it can end up being very preachy in a way that's not effective for your audience. It can just be something where the allegory takes over the quality of storytelling. Allegories are potent things. They're kind of like adding red curry paste to your meal. They are going to have a very strong flavor, and you need to make sure that you are handling everything well and that you are doing the work to make your story itself excellent and not just have the allegory be the only thing that people taste in it. And so allegories, potent, fantastic, but can also be a bit of a pitfall. And especially if you're going to make changes to your story or you're going to deal with people who make different interpretations of your story, there can be consequences. And for people who are like, well, I just don't write allegories, I just don't do that. If you're writing with any kind of strong values, you are making moral choices in your book about what is right and what is wrong, what is considered good and what is considered evil, and what is considered in the middle, what is considered morally gray if you're discussing those morally gray areas as well. You're making some kind of discussion of morality in there. And any discussion of morality and what we believe can quickly tilt towards allegory. So I'm not saying you have to include allegories in your stories. I don't for a lot of my books, but just be mindful that people will be bringing their thoughts to that and their desire to make meaning in that. They may read allegories that aren't there. You may put allegories in your story that weren't meant to be there. We still have many debates over Tolkien, who insists he didn't write allegories. And then you read some of his stuff and go, okay, I respect that you said you didn't, and I don't want to overstep that intent, but also, dude, really? No allegories in here? No symbols? No representations at all of your Catholic faith? So maybe in a future episode, we will talk about, allegorical representation versus simple worldview coming through and the differences between that, because all of that actually also impacts your marketing. So if nothing else, with this quick snippet of my much larger episode, I hope that you are first understanding that allegories are powerful things, that they can be interpreted many different ways. Mess around with them and play around with them very carefully, and at your peril. There can and often will be consequences to that, so make sure that you understand that ahead of time. And understand that if you're going heavy with allegory, you need to make sure that you're balancing that out with quality storytelling craft. And if you're trying to avoid allegory, understand that we're all humans here, and sometimes it just shows up anyway. And this is why having healthy critique partners and beta reader feedback can be so beneficial as you're going through the whole stages of writing and then figuring out how to market your book to the right audience. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. If you haven't already, do make sure that you've subscribed to this. And if you want the full awesome news roundup that this is just a small snippet of, do become a paid subscriber of my Author Culture Substack. Now, go forth and be awesome.